I guess I would have to go all the way back to when I was really young, seeing, I mean, I guess it must have been a rerun of Debbie Harry appearing on The Muppet Show. And without having any kind of language, in which to describe the experience at the time, I really felt like that, just her energy and her look and, the Blondie music that, she was singing on the show and everything else just felt like it was just this introduction to a whole world of things that were cool, which was something I hadn't even understood as like a concept before. I mean, I was a really young kid. I must have been like 5 years old. And, that something about being kind of dangerous and subversive and sly and not quite with the mainstream was all really there somehow for me in her performance. And it just generated this sense of curiosity that, about that time and that milieu, has lasted my whole life.
Mm. You mentioned kind of the energy and the look of Debbie Harry. Do you remember as a kid what struck you about that? Was it just because it was so different to anything you'd seen before?
I think there was something about her hair. I mean, if I recall correctly, it was, she had that just like peroxide blonde hair, and I think like, there were roots, and I'm sure she'd been completely cleaned up, for the show. But, and just wearing this shirt that kind of sat off her shoulder like it was kind of ripped, and it just was totally raw, I mean, even as much as I'm sure, as I said, that it had been like polished up for this incredibly kind of, network television for kids kind of TV show, it's still, you got the sense of it being just raw and so worlds away from anything that, my parents wore,
Mm.
certainly, or anybody, my teachers or anybody like that.
Mm. I'm interested that you mentioned this idea of something being, this idea of coolness, and that was the first time you kind of saw kind of that concept in action. Do you think for something to feel punkish, it's always got to feel a little bit sort of cool, a little bit subversive, a little bit outside of the mainstream?
Yeah, and I think that that's actually, in recent years, the I guess the caveat that I always have about when I see, punk symbolism or, aesthetics used in a fashion context, like on the runway, I always wonder, like, well, when something has gotten on to sort of a luxury brand runway, like studs or whatever, does it still have that element of, I guess, engagement with, or not engagement with, I guess, that element of rebellion, I
Mm.
mean, is really what it's about. And that sort of the saying no. And I'm not sure, I think that those symbols still have power, but I'm not sure what they speak to at this point.
Mm.
I'm not sure what the gesture is.
So do you think they still stand for anything about attitude, or is it just sort of aesthetic now? Because obviously, what struck you with Debbie Harry, it was her attitude and her energy, as you said. But when you see that punk symbolism now, is it purely kind of is its impact purely aesthetic?
No, I think that when designers use it and when people wear it, they're trying to get at that attitude, and I believe that because also, just living in the East Village and walking around, what was a long time ago the heart of the New York punk scene. I mean, you still see kids from wherever, who come to Tompkins Square Park and St. Mark's Place, and are, they're still wearing like studded jackets and they've got mohawks. And I mean, there aren't that many of them now, but, you know, there's something about punk and the symbols of punk that still have that, they still have that power, and it's just that they have been so appropriated as well,
Mm.
um, that I think it's very complicated. I don't have necessarily a good sort of pithy way of talking about my feelings about it, because I do think that it's quite complex. I think that, when a runway fashion designer, aside from perhaps like Vivienne Westwood, is throwing up like a studded motorcycle jacket and a ripped t-shirt on their runway, I think that they're trying to suggest that they have a sympathy with all of these ideals, and all of that kind of subversive attitude. I think they want to take a little bit of ownership of that, but I don't know to what end. I think it's like it's an homage, but I think every time you sort of get that homage, it taps out a little bit more of the power of the original statement.
No, for sure. Have you ever been at a show where you've felt kind of energized or moved or struck in the way you were as a child watching Debbie Harry?
I'll tell you that the show that really took my breath away in terms of just that kind of like, wow, they're really up to something here, was I'm not going to give you the exact date because I'm so bad about this, but the Meadham Kirchhoff Riot Girl show, which I think was spring 2010. It was either spring 2010 or 2011. I'm suddenly forgetting. But you just sensed, I think, in the work that Ben and Ed do generally, I think you really do sense a process of thought and dissatisfaction with status quo that feels like very punk to me. And I don't think that they have a tendency to actually use too many kind of original punk sort of aesthetics. But I do think that in terms of attitude, their interest in kind of rejecting what is considered to be, on trend or viable, or and just the way that they play with gender and street casting and all of that. They're really interested in challenging norms, which I find to be quite rare in the industry right now.
It's that thing of saying no, as you mentioned before, taking issue, I guess. Is that for you what underpins punk at its best?
I think, when I think about what gave punk its kind of original power, ultimately, as much as my original fascination was definitely like with Blondie, ultimately, like as I've grown older, I've become much more interested in what was happening with, punk in London, which I think was much more political and was much more about that kind of saying no and then finding constructive ways. It's not just about a negativity. I think that the beauty of punk is the way that it's democratized, it democratized fashion ultimately, because it really said, look, like, go ahead, grab a garbage bag and like make it a shirt, use your creativity to transform the world around you. But at the heart of it was definitely this aggressive posture towards, I think, people now, we're so used to seeing people walking around with piercings in their face or, crazy hair colors and tattoos and stuff like that, that you forget that when this emerged in, the 70s, seeing people who looked that way, if you were just like a middle-class person walking down the street, in central London, that would be quite shocking. You would really have a sense that that person had made a choice, not to participate in the culture as it existed. They weren't going to go get a sort of go nowhere job, and they weren't going to vote for, whoever like the prime minister was when they stood for re-election. It was just, they were really saying, we are going to create a different world. Like, we don't care about your world.
Do you think designers have kind of lost that? Today you mentioned, very few designers are saying no and going against the status quo. Do you think it's much harder for a designer now to create their own world because they're operating so much within this sphere of fashion. Kind of that's their world. It's hard to do something that's individual.
I think that that's an interesting question. I've actually talked a little bit to Ben and Ed from Meadham Kirchhoff about this, and one of the things that they have said that resonates with me is we live in a time where the rebellions are personal, that it's very hard to sort of create a movement, but that you can kind of find your sort of mini movement like online. You can find your little group of like-minded people. You, as like an individual, can make a choice, to in small various ways to go against the mainstream. But that for some reason we just don't seem to be in a time where there's much appreciation for a kind of mass, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that exactly. I think there are exceptions. I think maybe we're starting to turn the corner on that, looking at like what's been going on, with the Arab Spring and the protests in Turkey, and maybe there is something happening in the world, and Occupy Wall Street and all of that people are finally realizing that if they want to enact any change, it's fine to sort of tweet about things, but you actually have to go out and kind of be in the real world with your issues as well. To bring it back to fashion, I just think that designers in general are sort of participating in, as everyone is in our culture, a very conservative cultural moment. I think that's the bottom line. Is just I think we're seeing sort of lots of interesting innovation at the margins in terms of art, in terms of music, in terms of fashion, and in terms of whatever you look at. But we aren't seeing any big challenges anywhere, I don't think. I think the only sort of, to coin like a really obnoxious term, the only really disruptive ideas right now are coming through technology. And, maybe that's where like punk is going to live. Maybe punk is going to be about an app. And
perish the thought.
Perish the thought, yeah. Agreed.